After decades during which Donald floundered, dragged down by bankruptcies and reduced to fronting for a series of failed products from steaks to vodka, the television producer Mark Burnett gave him yet another chance. The Apprentice traded on Donald's image as the brash, self-made deal maker, a myth that had been the creation of my grandfather 5 decades earlier, and that astonishingly, considering the vast trove of evidence that's proving it, had survived into the new millennium almost entirely unaltered. By the time Donald announced his run for the Republican Party nomination in 2015, a significant percentage of the American population had been primed to believe that myth. To this day, the lies, misrepresentations, and fabrications that are the sum total of who my uncle is are perpetuated by the Republican Party and white evangelical Christians, people who know better, such as the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, true believers such as Representative Kevin McCarthy, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Attorney General William Barr, and others too numerous to name, have been unwittingly or not complicit in their perpetration. None of the Trump siblings emerged unscathed from my grandfather's sociopathy and my grandmother's illnesses, both physical and psychological. But my Uncle Donald and my father Freddie suffered more than the rest. In order to get a complete picture of Donald, his psychopathologies, and the meaning of his dysfunctional behavior, we need a thorough family history. In the last 3 years, I've watched as countless pundits, armchair psychologists, and journalists have kept missing the mark using phrases such as malignant narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder in an attempt to make Donald's sense of often bizarre and self-defeating behavior. I have no problem calling Donald a narcissist. He meets all 9 criteria as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM-5. But the label gets us only so far. I received my PhD in clinical psychology from the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies. And while doing research for my dissertation, I spent a year working on the admissions ward of Manhattan Psychiatric Center, a state facility where we diagnosed, evaluated, and treated some of the sickest, most vulnerable patients. In addition to teaching graduate psychology, including courses in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology, for several years as an adjunct professor, I provided therapy and psychological testing for patients at a community clinic specializing in addictions. Those experiences showed me time and time again that diagnosis doesn't exist in a vacuum. Does Donald have other symptoms we aren't aware of? Are there other disorders that might have as much or more explanatory power? Maybe. A case could be made that he also meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, which in its most severe form is generally considered sociopathy, but can also refer to chronic criminality, arrogance, and disregard for the rights of others. Is there comorbidity? Probably. Donald may also meet some of the criteria for dependent personality disorder, the hallmarks of which include an inability to make decisions or take responsibility, discomfort with being alone, and going to excessive lengths to obtain support from others. Are there other factors that should be considered? Absolutely. He may have a long undiagnosed learning disability for decades. He may have a long undiagnosed learning disability that for decades has interfered with his ability to process information. Also, he is alleged to drink upward of 12 Diet Cokes a day and sleep very little. Does he suffer from a substance, in this case caffeine, included sleep disorder? He has a horrible diet and does not exercise, which may contribute to or exacerbate his other possible disorders. The fact is, Donald's pathologies are so complex and his behaviors so often inexplicable that coming up with an accurate and comprehensive diagnosis would require a full battery of psychological and neuropsychological tests that he'll never sit for. At this point, we can't evaluate his day-to-day functioning because he is, in the West Wing, essentially institutionalized. Donald has been institutionalized for most of his adult life, so there is no way to know how he would thrive or even survive or on his own in the real world. At the end of my aunt's birthday party in 2017, as we lined up for our pictures, I could see that Donald was already under a kind of stress he'd never experienced before. As the pressures upon him have continued to mount over the course of the last 3 years, the disparity between the level of competence required for running a country and his incompetence had widened, revealing his delusions more starkly than ever before. Many, but by no means all of us, have been shielded until now from the worst effects of his pathologies by a stable economy and a lack of serious crises. But the out-of-control COVID-19 pandemic, the possibility of economic depression, deepening social divides along political lines, thanks to Donald's penchant for division, and devastating uncertainty about our country's future have created a perfect storm of catastrophes that no one is less equipped than my uncle to manage. Doing so would require courage, strength of responsibility, and to course correct after admitting mistakes. His ability to control unfavorable situations by lying, spinning, and obfuscating has diminished to the point of impotence in the midst of intentional mishandling of the current catastrophe has led to a level of pushback and scrutiny that he has never experienced before, increasing his belligerence and need for petty revenge as he withholds vital funding, personal protective equipment, and ventilators that your tax dollars have paid for from states whose governors don't kiss his ass sufficiently. I'm just going to go through that over one more time. Doing so would require courage, strength of character, deference to experts, and the confidence to take responsibility and to course correct after admitting mistakes. His ability to control unfavorable situations by lying, spinning, and obfuscating has diminished to the point of impotence in the midst of the tragedies we are currently facing. His egregious and arguably intentional mishandling of the current catastrophe has led to a level of pushback and scrutiny that he's never experienced before, increasing his belligerence and need for petty revenge as he withholds vital funding, personal protective equipment, and ventilators that your tax dollars have paid for from states whose governors don't kiss his ass sufficiently. In the 1994 film based on Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's novel, Frankenstein's Monster says, "I do know that for the sympathy of one living being, I would make peace with all. I have love in me the likes of you which you can scarcely imagine, and rage, the likes of which you would not believe. If I cannot satisfy the one, I will indulge the other. After referencing that quote, Charles P. Pierce wrote in Esquire, Donald doesn't plague himself with doubt about what he's creating around him. He is proud of his monster. He glories in its anger and its destruction. And while he cannot imagine its love, he believes with all his heart in its rage. He is Frankenstein without conscience. That could be more accurately have been said about Donald's father, Fred, with this crucial difference. Fred's monster, the only child of his who mattered to him, would ultimately be rendered unlovable by the very nature of Fred's preference for him. In the end, there would be no love for Donald at all, just his agonizing thirsting for it. The rage left to grow would come to overshadow everything else. When Ronna Graff, Donald's longtime gatekeeper, sent me and my daughter an invitation to attend Donald's election night party in New York City, I declined. I wouldn't be able to contain my euphoria when Clinton's victory was announced, and I didn't want to be rude. At 5 the next morning, only a couple of hours after the opposite result had been announced, I was wandering around my house, as traumatized as many other people, but in a more personal way. It felt as though 62,979,636 voters had chosen to turn this country into a macro version of my malignantly dysfunctional family. Within a month of the election, I found myself compulsively watching the news and checking my Twitter feed, anxious and unable to concentrate on anything else. Though nothing Donald did surprise me, the speed and volume with which he started inflicting his worst impulses on the country, from lying about the crowd size at the inauguration and whining about how poorly he was treated, to rolling back environmental protections, targeting the Affordable Care Act in order to take affordable health care away from millions of people, and enacting his racist Muslim ban overwhelmed me. The smallest thing, seeing Donald's face or hearing my own name, both of which happened dozens of times a day, took me back to the time when my father had withered and died beneath the cruelty and contempt of my grandfather. I had lost him when he was only 42 and I was 16. The horror of Donald's cruelty was being magnified by the fact that his acts were now official U.S. policy, affecting millions of people. The atmosphere of division my grandfather created in the Trump family is the water in which Donald has always swum, and division continues to benefit him at the expense of everybody else. It's wearing the country down, just as it did my father, changing us as if it leaves Donald unaltered. It's weakening our ability to be kind or believe in forgiveness, concepts that have never had any meaning for him. His administration and his party have become subsumed by his politics of grievance and entitlement. Worse, Donald, who understands nothing about history, constitutional principles, geopolitics, diplomacy, or anything else really, and was never pressed to demonstrate such knowledge, has evaluated all his country's alliances and all our social programs solely through the prism of money, just as his father taught him to do. The costs and benefits of governing are considered in purely financial terms, as if the U.S. Treasury was his personal piggy bank. To him, every dollar going out was his loss, while every dollar saved was his gain. In the midst of obscene plenty, one person, using all the levers of power and taking every advantage at his disposal, would benefit himself and, conditionally, his immediate family, his cronies, and his sycophants. For the rest, there would be enough to go around, which was exactly how my grandfather ran our family. It's extraordinary that for all the attention and coverage that Donald has received in the last 50 years, he's been subjected to very little scrutiny. Though his character flaws and aberrant behavior have been remarked upon and joked about, there's very little effort to understand not only why he became who he is, but how he's consistently failed up despite his glaring lack of fitness. Donald has, in some sense, always been institutionalized, shielded from his limitations or need to succeed on his own in the world. Honest work was never demanded of him, and no matter how badly he failed, he was rewarded in ways that are almost unfathomable. He continues to be protected from his own disasters in the White House, where a claque of loyalists applauds his every pronouncement or covers up his possible criminal negligence by normalizing it to the point that we've become almost numb to the accumulating transgressions. But now the stakes are far higher than they've ever been before. They are literally life and death. Unlike any previous time in his life, Donald's failings cannot be hidden or ignored because they threaten us all. Although my aunts and uncles will think otherwise, I'm not writing this book to cash in or out of a desire for revenge. If either of those had been my intention, I would have written a book about our family years ago, when there was no way to anticipate that Donald would trade on his reputation as a serially bankrupt businessman, and it would have been safer because my uncle wasn't in a position to threaten and endanger whistleblowers and critics. The events of the last 3 years, however, have forced my hand, and I can no longer remain silent. By the time this book is published, hundreds of thousands of American lives will have been sacrificed on the altar of Donald's hubris and willful ignorance. If he is afforded a second term, it would be the end of American democracy. No one knows how Donald came to be who he is better than his own family. Unfortunately, almost all of them remain silent out of loyalty or fear. I'm not hindered by either of those. In addition to the first-hand accounts I can give as my father's daughter and my uncle's only niece, I have the perspective of a trained clinical psychologist. Too much and never enough is the story of the most visible and powerful family in the world, and I am the only Trump who is willing to tell it. I hope this book will end the practice of referring to Donald's strategies or agendas as if he operates according to any organizing principles. He doesn't. Donald's ego has been and is a fragile and inadequate barrier between him and the real world, which, thanks to his father's money and power, he never had to negotiate by himself. Donald has always needed to perpetuate the fiction my grandfather started, that he is strong, smart, and otherwise extraordinary, because facing the truth that he is none of these things is too terrifying for him to contemplate. Donald, following the lead of my grandfather, with the complicity, silence, and inaction of his siblings, destroyed my father. I can't let him destroy my country. Okay, part 1. Cruelty is the point. Chapter 1. The House. Daddy, Mom's bleeding! They lived in a house, as my grandparents' home was known, for less than a year. And it still felt unfamiliar, especially in the middle of the night. So when 12-year-old Marianne found her mother lying unconscious in one of the upstairs bedrooms, not the master bathroom, but the bathroom she and her sister shared down the hall, she was already disoriented. There was blood all over the bathroom floor. Marianne's terror was so great that it overcame her usual reluctance to disturb her father in his bedroom, and she flew into the other end of the house to rouse him. Fred got out of the bed, walked directly down the hall, and found his wife unresponsive. With Marianne at his heels, he rushed back to his bedroom where there was a telephone extension and placed a call. Already a powerful man with connections at Jamaica Hospital, Fred was immediately put into touch with someone who could get an ambulance to the house and make sure the best doctors were waiting for them when they arrived at the emergency room. Fred explained the situation as best he could to the person on the other end. Marianne heard him say menstruation, an unfamiliar word that sounded strange coming out of her father's mouth. Shortly after Mary arrived at the hospital, she underwent an emergency hysterectomy after doctors found that serious postpartum complications had gone undiagnosed after Robert's birth 9 months earlier. The procedure led to an abdominal infection, and then further complications arose. From what would become his usual spot by the telephone table in the library, Fred spoke briefly with one of Mary's doctors, and after hanging up the phone, called Marianne to join him. "They told me your mother won't make it through the night," he said to his daughter. A little while later, as he was leaving for the hospital to be with his wife, he told her, "Go to school tomorrow. I'll call you if there's any change." She understood the implication. "I will call you if your mother dies." Marianne spent the night crying alone in her room while her younger siblings remained asleep in their beds, unaware of the calamity. She went to school the next day, full of dread. Dr. James Dixon, the headmaster of Kew Forest, a private school she had begun attending when her father joined the board of directors, came to get her from the study hall. "There's a phone call for you in my office." Marianne was convinced that her mother was dead. The walk to the principal's office was like a walk to the scaffold. All the 12-year-old could think was that she was going to be the acting mother of 4 children. When she picked up the phone, her father simply said, "She's going to make it." Mary would undergo 2 more surgeries over the next week, but she did indeed make it. Fred's pull at the hospital, which ensued that his wife got the very best doctors and care, had probably saved her life, but it would be a long road back to recovery. For the next 6 months, Mary was in and out of the hospital. The long-term implications for her health were serious. She eventually developed severe osteoporosis from the sudden loss of estrogen that went with having her ovaries removed along with her uterus, a common but often unnecessary medical procedure performed at the time. As a result, She was often in excruciating pain, from spontaneous fractures to her ever-thinning bones. If we're lucky, we have, as infants and toddlers, at least one emotionally available parent who consistently fulfills our needs and responds to our desires for attention. Being held and comforted, having our feelings acknowledged, and our upset soothed are all critical for the healthy development of young children. This kind of attention creates a sense of safety and security that ultimately allows us to explore the world around us without excessive fear or unmanageable anxiety, because we know we can count on the bedrock support of at least one caregiver. Mirroring the process through which an attuned parent reflects, processes, and then gives back to the baby's own feelings, is another crucial part of a young child's development. Without mirroring, children are denied crucial information about how their minds work and about how to understand the world. Just as a secure attachment to a primary caregiver can lead to higher levels of emotional intelligence, mirroring is the root of empathy. Mary and Fred were problematic parents from the very beginning. My grandmother rarely spoke to me about her own parents or childhood, so I can only speculate, but she was the youngest of 10 children, 21 years younger than her oldest sibling and 4 years younger than the second youngest. And she grew up in an often inhospitable environment in the early 1910s. Whether her own needs weren't sufficiently met when she was a child, or for some other reason, she was the kind of mother who used her children to comfort herself rather than comforting them. She attended to them when it was convenient for her, not when they needed her to. Often unstable and needy, prone to self-pity and flights of martyrdom, she frequently put herself first, especially when it came to her sons. She acted as if there was nothing she could do for them. During and after her surgeries, Mary's absence, both literal and emotional, created a void in the lives of her children. As hard as it must have been for Marianne, Freddie, and Elizabeth, they were old enough to understand what was happening and could to some extent take care of themselves. The impact was especially dire for Donald and Robert, who at 2.5 years and 9 months old, respectively, were the most vulnerable of her children, especially since there was no one else to fill the void. The live-in housekeeper was undoubtedly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of housework. Their paternal grandmother, who lived nearby, prepared meals, but she was as terse and physically unaffectionate as her son. When Marianne wasn't in school, much of the responsibility of taking care of the younger kids fell to her. As a boy, Freddie wouldn't have been expected to help. She gave them baths and got them ready for bed, but at 12, there was only so much she could do. The 5 kids were essentially motherless. Whereas Mary was needy, Fred seemed to have no emotional needs at all. In fact, he was a high-functioning sociopath. Although uncommon, sociopathy is not rare, afflicting as much as 3% of the population. 75% of those diagnosed are men. Symptoms of sociopathy include a lack of empathy, a facility for lying, an indifference to right and wrong, abusive behavior, and a lack of interest in the rights of others. Having a sociopath as a parent, especially if there is no one else around to mitigate the effects, all but guarantees severe disruption in how children understand themselves, regulate their emotions, and engage with the world. My grandmother was ill-equipped to deal with the problems caused in her marriage by Fred's callousness, indifference, and controlling behaviors. Fred's lack of real human feeling, his rigidity as a parent and as a husband, and his sexist belief in a woman's innate inferiority likely left her feeling unsupported. Since Mary was emotionally and physically absent due to her injuries, Fred became by default the only available parent, but it would be a mistake to refer to him as a caregiver. He firmly believed that dealing with young children was not his job and kept to his 12-hour-a-day, 6-day-a-week job at Trump Management, as if his children could look after themselves. He focused on what was important to him, his increasingly successful business, which at the time was developing Shore Haven and Beach Haven, two massive residential projects in Brooklyn that were to date the most significant of his life. Again, Donald and Robert in particular would have been in the most precarious positions vis-a-vis Fred's lack of interest. All behavior exhibited by infants and toddlers is a form of attachment behavior, which seeks a positive, comforting response from the caregiver, a smile to elicit a smile, tears to prompt a hug. Even under normal circumstances, Fred would have considered any expressions of that kind of an annoyance. But Donald and Robert were likely even needier because they missed their mother and were actively distressed by her absence. The greater their distress, however, the more Fred rebuffed them. He did not like to have demands made of him, and the annoyance provoked by his children's neediness set up a dangerous tension in the Trump household. By engaging in behaviors that were biologically designed to trigger soothing, comforting responses from their parents, the little boys instead provoked their father's anger or indifference when they were most vulnerable. For Donald and Robert, needing became equated with humiliation, despair, and hopelessness. Because Fred didn't want to be disturbed when he was home, it worked in his favor if his children learned one way or another not to need anything. Fred's parenting style actually exasperated the negative effects of Mary's absence. As a result of it, his children were isolated not just from the rest of the world, but from one another. From then on, it would become increasingly difficult for the siblings to find solidarity with other human beings, which is one of the reasons Freddie's brothers and sisters ultimately failed him. Standing up for him, even helping him, would have risked their father's wrath. When Mary became ill, and Donald's main source of comfort and human connection was suddenly taken away from him, not only was there no one to help him make sense of it, Fred was the only person left that he could depend on. Donald's needs, which had been met inconsistently before his mother's illness, were barely met at all by his father. That Fred would, by default, become the primary source of Donald's solace when he was much more likely to be a source of fear or rejection, put Donald into an intolerable position, being totally dependent on his father, who was also likely to be a source of his terror. Child abuse, in some sense, the experience of too much or not enough. Child abuse is, in some sense, the experience of too much or not enough. Donald directly experienced the not enough in the loss of the connection to his mother at a crucial development stage, which was deeply traumatic. Without warning, his needs weren't being met, and his fears and longings went unsoothed. Having been abandoned by his mother for at least a year, and having his father fail not only to meet his needs, but to make him feel safe or loved, valued or mirrored, Donald suffered deprivations that would scar him for life. The personality traits that resulted: displays of narcissism, bullying, grandiosity, finally made my grandfather take notice, but not in a way that ameliorated any of the horror that had come before. As he grew older, Donald was subjected to my grandfather's too muchness. At secondhand, witnessing what happened to Freddie when he was on the receiving end of too much attention, too much expectation, and most saliently, too much humiliation. From the beginning, Fred's self-interest skewed his priorities. His care of his children, such as it was, reflected his own needs, not theirs. Love meant nothing to him, and he could not empathize with their plight. One of the defining characteristics of a sociopath: he expected obedience, that was all. Children don't make such distinctions, and his kids believed that their father loved them or that they could somehow earn his love. But they also knew, if only on an unconscious level, that their father's love, as they experienced it, was entirely conditional. Mary Ann, Elizabeth, and Robert, to greater or lesser degrees, experienced the same treatment as Donald because Fred wasn't interested in his children at all. His oldest son and namesake received Fred's attention simply because he was being raised to carry Fred's legacy. In order to cope, Donald began to develop powerful but primitive defenses, marked by an increasing hostility to others and a seeming indifference to his mother's absence and father's neglect. The latter became a kind of learned helplessness over time, because although it insulated him from the worst effects of his pain, it also made it extremely difficult, and in the long run, I would argue, impossible, for him to have any of his emotional needs met at all, because he became too adept at acting as though he didn't have any. In place of those needs grew a kind of grievance and behaviors, including bullying, disrespect, and aggressiveness that served their purpose in the moment but became more problematic over time. With appropriate care and attention, they might have been overcome. Unfortunately for Donald and everybody else on this planet, those behaviors became hardened into his personality traits, because once Fred started paying attention to his loud and difficult second son, he came to value them. Put another way, Fred Trump came to validate, encourage, and champion the things about Donald that rendered him essentially unlovable, and that were in part the direct result of Fred's abuse. Mary never completely recovered. Restless to begin with, she became an insomniac. The older kids would find her wandering around the house at all hours like a soundless wraith. Once Freddie found her standing at the top of a ladder, painting in the hallway in the middle of the night. In the morning, her children sometimes found her unconscious in unexpected places. More than once, she ended up having to go to the hospital. That behavior became a part of the life of the house. Mary got help for the physical injuries she sustained, but none for whatever underlying psychological problems made her put herself into high-risk situations. Beyond his wife's occasional injuries, Fred was aware of none of this and wouldn't have acknowledged the effects of his particular brand of parenting had on his children then or later, even if he had recognized them. As far as he was concerned, he had been for a brief time faced with the limits of his wealth and power in fixing his wife's near-death health crisis. But ultimately, Mary's medical challenges were a small blip in the grand scheme of things. Once she was on the mend, and his Shore Haven and Beach Haven real estate developments, both phenomenal successes, were nearing completion, everything seemed once again to be going Fred's way. When 8-year-old Freddie Trump asked why his very pregnant mother was getting so fat, talk at the dinner table ground to a halt. It was 1948, and the Trump family, which now consisted of 4 children, 10-year-old Marianne, Freddie, 5-year-old Elizabeth, and 1.5-year-old Donald, were weeks away from moving into the 23-room house that Fred was in the process of building. Marianne looked down at her plate, and Fred's mother, also named Elizabeth, an almost daily visitor to the house, stopped eating. Table etiquette at my grandparents' house was strict, and there were certain things Fred did not tolerate. "Keep your elbows off the table. This is not a horse's stable," was a frequent refrain, and Fred, knife in hand, would tap his handle against the forearm of the transgressor. Rob and Donald took over that task when Fritz, David, and I were growing up with a bit too much enthusiasm. There were also things the children were not supposed to talk about, especially in front of their father or grandfather. When Freddie wanted to know how the baby had gotten there, Fred and his mother stood up as one, left the table without saying a word, and walked off. Fred wasn't a prude, but Elizabeth, a stern, formal woman who adhered to Victorian mores, very likely was. Despite her own rigid views regarding gender roles, however, she had many years earlier made an exception for her son. A couple of years after Fred's father has died suddenly, Elizabeth had become her 15-year-old son's business partner. That was made possible in part because her husband, Friedrich Trump, something of an entrepreneur, had left money and property valued at approximately $300,000 in today's currency. Friedrich, born in Karlstadt, a small village in western Germany, left for the United States when he turned 18 in 1885 in order to avoid mandatory military service. He eventually made the bulk of his money through ownership of restaurants and brothels in British Columbia. He lit out for the Yukon territories in time for the gold rush, cashing out just before the boom collapsed near the turn of the century. In 1901, while visiting his family in Germany, Friedrich met and married Elizabeth Christ, a petite blonde woman nearly 12 years his junior. He brought his new bride to New York, but 1 month after the birth of their child, a girl named Elizabeth, the couple returned to Germany with the intention on settling there permanently. Because of the circumstances under which Friedrich had originally left the country, he was told by authorities that he could not stay. Friedrich and his wife, now 4 months pregnant with their second child, and their 2-year-old daughter, returned for the last time to the United States in July 1905. Their 2 sons, Frederick and John, were born in 1905 and 1907 respectively. They eventually settled in Woodhaven, Queens, where all 3 children grew up speaking German. When Friedrich died of the Spanish flu, 12-year-old Fred became the man of the house. Despite the size of her husband's estate, Elizabeth found it difficult to make ends meet. The flu epidemic, which killed upward of 50 million people worldwide, had a destabilizing effect on what otherwise might have been a booming wartime economy. While still in high school, Fred took a series of odd jobs in order to help his mother financially and began to study the building trade. Becoming a builder had been his dream for as long as he could remember. He took every opportunity to learn the businesses, all aspects of which intrigued him. And during his sophomore year, with his mother's backing, he began building and selling garages in his neighborhood. He realized he was good at it, and from then on he had no other interest, none. 2 years after Fred's high school graduation, Elizabeth created E. Trump and Son. She recognized her son's aptitude and the business, which enabled her to handle financial transactions for her underage middle child. In the early 20th century, people didn't attain legal majority until the age of 21, was her way of supporting him. Both the business and the family thrived. When Fred was 25 years old, he attended a dance where he met Mary Ann MacLeod, recently arrived from Scotland. According to family legend, when he returned home, he told his mother that he had met the girl he was going to marry. Mary had been born the youngest of 10 in 1912 in Tongue, a village on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, located 40 miles off the northwest coast of Scotland. Her childhood had been bracketed by two global tragedies, the latter of which also deeply affected her future husband: World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic. Lewis had lost a disproportionate percentage of its male population during the war, and in a cruel twist of fate, 2 months after the armistice was signed in November 1918, a ship carrying soldiers home to the island from the mainland crashed into rocks just a few yards offshore in the early hours of January 1st, 1919. More than 200 soldiers of the approximately 280 on board died in the brutally cold waters less than a mile from the safety of Stornoway Harbor. Much of the island's young adult male population was lost. Any young woman hoping to find a husband would have to have better luck elsewhere. Mary, one of 6 daughters, was encouraged to journey to America, where opportunities were greater and the men more plentiful. In early May 1930, in a classic example of chain migration, Mary boarded the RMS Transylvania in order to join 2 of her sisters who had already settled in the United States. Despite her status as a domestic servant, as a white Anglo-Saxon, Mary would have been allowed into the country even under her son's draconian new immigration rules introduced nearly 90 years later. She turned 18 the day before her arrival in New York and met Fred not long after. Fred and Mary were married on a Saturday in January 1936. After a reception at the Carlisle Hotel in Manhattan, they honeymooned in Atlantic City for one night. On Monday morning, Fred was back at his Brooklyn office. The couple moved into their first house on Wareham Road, just down the street from the house on Devonshire Road that Fred had shared with his mother. In those early years, Mary was still in awe of her head-spinning change in fortune, both financial and social. Instead of being the live-in help, she had live-in help. Instead of competing for limited resources, she was the woman of the house. With free time to volunteer and money with which to shop, she never looked back, which perhaps explains why she was quick to judge others who came from similar circumstances. She and Fred put together an entirely conventional life with strictly drawn lines for husband and wife. He ran his business, which kept him in Brooklyn 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She ran the house, but he ruled it, and, at least in the beginning, so did his mother. Elizabeth was an intimidating mother-in-law who, during the first few years of her son's marriage, made sure that Mary understood who was really in charge. She wore white gloves when she visited, putting Mary on notice regarding the expectations she had for her daughter-in-law's housekeeping, which must have felt like a not so subtle mockery of her recent employment. Despite Elizabeth's hazing, those early years were a time of great energy and possibility for Fred and Mary. Fred whistled his way down the stairs on his way to work, and when he returned home in the evening, he whistled his way up to his room, where he changed into a clean shirt before dinner. Mary and Fred hadn't discussed baby names, so when their first child, a daughter, was born, they named her Mary Ann, combining Mary's first name and middle names. The couple's first son was born a year and a half later, on October 14, 1938, and named after his father with one small change. Fred Sr.'s middle name was Christ, his mother's maiden name. His boy would be named Frederick Christ. Everybody except his father would call him Freddie. It seems as though Fred mapped out his son's future before he was even born. Although he would feel the burdens of the expectations placed upon him when he grew older, Freddie benefited early on from his status in a way Mary Ann and the other children would not. After all, he had a special place in his father's plans. He would be the means through which the Trump empire expanded and thrived in perpetuity. 3.5 years passed before Mary gave birth to another child. Shortly before the arrival of Elizabeth, Fred left for an extended period to work in Virginia Beach. A housing shortage, the result of service members returning from World War II, created an opportunity for him to build apartments for Navy personnel and their families. Fred had time to sharpen his skills and gain the reputation that got him the work because while other eligible men had enlisted, he had chosen not to serve, following in his father's footsteps. Through his growing experience with building many houses simultaneously and his inherent skill at using local media to own his ends, Fred was introduced to well-connected politicians and earned through them how to call in favors at the right time, and most important, chase government money. The lure in Virginia Beach, where Fred learned the advantage of building his real estate empire by government handouts, was the generous funding made available by the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. Founded in 1934 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the FHA seems to have strayed far from its original mandate by the time Fred began taking advantage of the largesse. By the time Fred began taking advantage of its largesse, its chief purpose had been to ensure that enough affordable housing was being built for the country's constantly growing population. After World War II, the FHA seemed equally concerned with enriching developers such as Fred Trump. The project in Virginia was also a chance to hone the expertise he'd begun to acquire in Brooklyn, building larger-scale projects as quickly, efficiently, and cheaply as possible while still managing to make them attractive to renters. When the commute back and forth to Queens became too inconvenient, Fred moved the entire family to Virginia Beach when Elizabeth was still an infant. From Mary's perspective, other than finding herself in an unfamiliar environment, things were much the same in Virginia as they had been in Jamaica Estates. Fred worked long hours, leaving her alone with 3 children under the age of 6. Their social life revolved around people he worked with or whose services he needed. In 1944, when the FHA funding that had been financing Fred's projects dried up, the family returned to New York. Once back in Jamaica Estates, Mary suffered a miscarriage, a serious medical event from which it took her months to recover fully. Doctors warned her against further pregnancies, but Mary found herself expecting again a year later. The miscarriage created large age gaps between the older and younger children, with Elizabeth floating in the middle, almost 4 years younger or older than her two closest siblings. Mary Ann and Freddie were so much older than the two youngest children that it was almost as if they belonged to two different generations. Donald, the couple's fourth child and second son, was born in 1946, just as Fred began plans for the new family house. He purchased a half-acre lot directly behind the Wareham Roadhouse, situated on a hill overlooking Midland Parkway, a wide, tree-lined thoroughfare that runs through the entire neighborhood. When the kids found out about the impending move, they joked that they didn't need to hire a moving truck, that they could just roll their belongings down the hill. At more than 4,000 square feet, the house was the most impressive residence on the block, but still smaller and less grand than many of the mansions that dominated the hills in the northern part of the neighborhood. Set at the top of a rise,